Hey everyone.
Hi.
It's great to see everyone. We've got a few people still joining here. As we're getting up and going, please go ahead and just use that Zoom chat. Let us know where you're joining us from. I know we have friends tuning in from, up and down the East Coast, certainly the Hudson Valley, goodness, Princeton, DC. We've got folks in Texas, Utah, Egypt, which I love. So as you're going ahead and getting up and going, let us know where you are. It's great to see everyone. I hope this finds you staying safe and well. For those I haven't met yet, I think I've met most of you, but if not, I'm Terry Babcock-Lumish. I serve as Executive Secretary of the Truman Foundation and CEO of Friends of Truman, which is our nonprofit partner. I particularly want to thank our National Council, Legacy Society, Pay It Forward members, and other donors for their generosity in supporting our leaders in public service. We really, really appreciate all of the generosity, and if there were ever a time to reinvest in public service and public servants, now is certainly it. So then we have a great conversation today I've really been looking forward to. Many of you will have noticed that extra thick New York Times this weekend. While we're all treading with care, certainly, as we follow the Delta and other variants, it's impossible not to be excited that the lights are back on Broadway. Navigating the realities of our pandemic, theaters around the world have begun to reopen with new health protocols, all while facing substantial financial challenges and certainly continued COVID concerns. From local playhouses to community anchors like the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, theater, we know, represents an escape. It's a forum to tackle pressing issues. It's an outlet for all of us. So just to set the scene a little bit, because I think it's also helpful to provide some context. In 2019, live theater contributed more than $9 billion to our domestic economy. So that's not million, that is billion. In addition to being entertaining and inspiring and provocating, we know our arts and culture, it's a significant driver of our economy. It's a significant industry. And so that's not to be taken lightly. And certainly Katie, our guest speaker today, has spent some time with Senator Schumer having this very conversation. We are just thrilled to have the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival's Managing Director, Katie Liberman, here with us today. And I think it's only proper to disclose my own bias, as I've been a repeat offender or a frequent flyer since moving to New York from England a decade ago. The festival is one of my favorite things about summers in the Hudson Valley. And I was thrilled to have seen Katie and her company just this past Labor Day weekend for closing night of not just the Tempest, which was magnificent, but it was closing night for their 34-year run on the grounds of historic Boscobel, which many of you are familiar with. Founded in 1987, the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival is known for inventive productions and an iconic open-air theater tent perched high above the Hudson River right across from West Point. So Katie is someone that we can learn a lot from keeping everyone safe to tackling systemic racism head-on in American theater, to arts education and reinvention made possible by a generous gift, which I think we're going to hear a little bit about. There's an awful lot Katie is going to cover. So let me just tell you a little bit about her and I'll turn it over. She's a proud graduate of Penn, from which we selected her as our 2006 Massachusetts Truman Scholar. She's also a graduate of Yale's Joint MBA MFA in theater management. Katie is a respected leader amongst leaders in our Truman community. She's also just a dear friend. So I'm excited for this conversation. Katie, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Terry. Wow, that was an amazing introduction. Terry, I'm just going to bring you with me whenever I'm speaking publicly and ask you to introduce me, please. That was just so extraordinary. And you should become an advocate for theater in America, too. We need you speaking up about the impact that we have. And Terry mentioned this past weekend's New York Times, so I'm actually going to put in the chat an article. I didn't include it in my presentation, but you can read this later, but it's an article that was there's a big theater preview, as Terry mentioned, as theater is reopening here in New York. I should say indoor Broadway theater is reopening. I'll speak all about the reopening of my theater, the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, in a minute. But in this article that I just linked to, the author actually speaks about her first theater going experience since the pandemic, which was at our production of The Tempest. So we were very proud to be a part of the theater preview, even though we had just closed our season. And there's a nice little piece about what it's like to be coming back, to be sitting amongst other audience members in 2021 with masks on and needing to show your vaccination card, et cetera. So I encourage that for reading and to hear a little bit more about the Shakespeare Festival and what we do. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides to kind of walk you all through, to talk to you a little bit about the work that I do. You know, I was going to introduce myself, but Terry did such a good job. I have really little to say, other than to just say that I'd love for this to be conversational. If folks want to, I don't mind if anybody takes themselves off mute to ask a question or raise your hand. Tyler, I know, is going to be watching the chat and hand raising too, but don't feel like this has to be, you know, just me speaking and then we can stop for questions. Please feel free to interrupt with questions as we go. And the only other thing I wanted to say before I kind of turn on the slides and the screen share is for those of you who are Trumans, or I think you're all involved with the foundation in one way or another, which is why you're here, you're friends of the Shakespeare Festival or Terry. But I wanted to harken back. I was thinking as I was prepping this presentation last night to my own application to become a Truman Scholar and my policy proposal, which some of you might be familiar with the fact that when you apply to be a Truman Scholar, you have to submit a proposal of policy that you think should be drafted, which allows you know, a group of 21-year-olds to be really bold in imagining the future of our country, let alone our world. And I'll say my policy proposal was about the creation of a national theater, which would be a theater that would also not just produce plays, but serve as a community hub and a place for people to come that would be open space for gathering. That would be a place where people could go to vote and could meet together and have community meetings. It would really serve as a sort of national hub for art making and gathering. And I bring that up now because you're going to hear a little bit about what I've been working on. And as I was prepping this last night, I thought, oh, look at that. I actually am I feel just so incredibly grateful and lucky to be in a place where I'm working on something that actually aligns with what I was dreaming up back in the spring of or winter of 2006. So thank you to Terry and the Truman Foundation for making that possible, and to my current employer, I guess, for letting me do that. So that was a long intro, and I'm gonna bring up some slides here, if that's all right. Can you all see my screen? I'm just gonna put this in the presentation view. Everybody can see that? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. Thank you, Michael, for your nod. Everyone's on mute, so that was encouraging. So I'm just going to jump right into it and tell you a little bit about the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, and then speak more about what has happened to the theater industry at large, how our organization has changed or pivoted, and I guess the both best and worst word of 2021 of pivoting, and the extraordinary opportunity ahead for our organization. But first, just some background. This is a drone shot of our theater. And for those who have come, I know Terry and Brian actually have been there recently, but just to give background for those who have not, as Terry mentioned, this is over a site that is overlooking the Hudson River, specifically Constitution Marsh. I know we've got some West Point folks on this Zoom. And we have been producing theater since 1987. And for 34 of those 35 years, that has been on the grounds of a historic house museum called Boscobel House and Gardens. We are a repertory theater, which means that we produce multiple plays that change every night. So you might see The Tempest on one night, and then you get to see Into the Woods the following night, and then you get to see, you know, a small comedy the following night, and they run in rotation. And that's really been a hallmark of our work. The other hallmark, of course, is the experience. You can see in this photo, there's people outside having a picnic outdoors before a show. For people who may be familiar with Tanglewood or other outdoor venues, very much like that. And then we welcome everyone into this open air, iconic theater tent that Terry mentioned that overlooks that view. But what is particularly both unique and challenging is the fact that all of these structures that you see here, this is our theater, this is our dressing rooms, these are the bathrooms, these little trailers here, this is the concessions. It's all temporary, it's all tensile. And we're about to be moving to a more permanent existence, and I'm excited to speak to you all about that. Let's see if I can switch slides. There we go. So a little bit more background, just for those who are in the nonprofit industry. We are a nonprofit professional theater with a season of theater that has historically been from June until September. We have about a $3.5 million operating budget that's based on pre-COVID numbers, I should say. We estimate that we contribute about $4 million in local economic impact. That has to do with people buying tickets, the people that we employ, people we house in the region who are shopping at the grocery stores, people going out to dinner beforehand, taking taxis, the whole thing. It has real impact on the small local businesses in the town of Cold Spring, where we are in New York. We hire about 200 people at the height of our season. That is really a significant payroll that has great impact. And we reach an audience of about 30,000 people. We also have as Terry briefly hinted at, a significant education program, which tours to schools throughout the tri-state region. So that's New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. We go to about 60 schools, sending teaching artists into those schools and sending a show on tour. But because of the nature of the length of our season, June until September, we've never actually been able to welcome schools to our theater. We send things out to those communities. Something else that we've really been thinking about a lot is sort of who we are at this moment of our reckoning around race and injustice, which I'll speak more about. But we are committed to being a classical repertory theater. But for us, Shakespeare and the classical work is really a site for inclusion and community engagement and gathering. And we're really focused on finding ways to use these texts to be sources for collective imagination and growth and change. And, we're committed mostly, as you can see from these images here, to work that engages the direct conversation between our actors and our audience and the landscape, which you can see out there in the distance. We have very minimal scenery. It's really all about the actor, the audience, and the landscape. Our mission is to engage the widest possible audience in a theatrical celebration of our shared humanity. So that's some background. I'm going to jump to October of 2019, if we can all remember what it was like back then. It was a different world for everybody, I imagine, on this Zoom. And October 2019, we had just finished at the Shakespeare Festival, a really successful season. We had produced our first musical, Into the Woods. And at that fall moment, we were in conversations with Boscobel, our longtime hosts, about a 30-year longtime lease. And in the midst of those conversations, we were approached by an extraordinary benefactor, a local philanthropist in the Hudson Valley named Chris Davis. And he had a vision for the community. He was the owner of a 200-acre golf course right in the center of Garrison with river views. And he was ready to sunset golf. And his vision included contributing, as you can see from this slide, 98 acres of this riverfront property to the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival. You can see the view in the background there. And in the foreground is actually our design team in the summer of 2020, thinking about what to do with this extraordinary property. The remainder of those 200 acres includes a contribution of land to our local land trust for permanent conservation, as well as a small property that would be a residence for Chris's family. So just to pause there, because this is just like this extraordinary moment, both for our company, I think for the theater industry at large. And sometimes when I speak about this, I think that this is just, it's a once in a generation philanthropic act that you really don't hear about in any nonprofit industry, let alone the theater. And it totally transformed how we think about the future for the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, and in fact, for the overall Hudson Valley region, and what it could mean if we became not just a seasonal festival, but a cultural anchor for the whole area. So that's where we were in the fall of 2019. And then it was March of 2020. And here are just a couple of headlines from the New York Times during the pandemic. And these are not even recent headlines. These are headlines from throughout it. But as Terry spoke about, as I think for everyone who's on this call is familiar with, the pandemic put the entire creative industry and specifically the performing arts on a total standstill. It was devastating. We're talking about millions of people out of work, That's people who are actors and artists, but people who are selling tickets, people who are building scenery, people working in the concessions, people who are involved in every aspect of our industry who are completely out of work, and a huge, huge amount of economic impact gone. The Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival canceled our 2020 season, among every other theater that closed. And at that moment, we really didn't know what would be next. It was a real moment of fear and uncertainty. At that same time, and we all lived through this, it was the summer of 2020, and in the wake of George Floyd's murder, as we all went through and continued to go through a national reckoning around race and injustice and equity and diversity, there was a movement in the National American Theater movement around questioning exactly how we as an industry are grappling with those issues. This shot on my screen, but on the presentation here is the first page of what was called the We See You White American Theater Movement, and where a group of BIPOC theater makers wrote a list of demands to the industry about how we needed to change and transform our practices and policies to do better by our artists and our staff, and to really rethink who we are. And that caused a real pause, not just for the Shakespeare Festival, again, but for our industry, and I'm sure for others who are on here for your industries and the work that you do, to begin to rethink how you do your work and how we did our work. And we continue to do that. It provoked a change in our mission and values, our core values that we publish about the institution. It changed how we work together as a staff. We now have a published code of community about how we work together, and we have bi-weekly anti-racism meetings with a facilitator for our staff. And it actually changed how we were making theater as well, which I can speak to next, because ultimately, oh, sorry, I missed my next slide, but it's all for good. My next slide, this is to say, we were in a real moment of concern. We didn't know what was next, both with regards to what was next for our industry as we were having a moment of introspection, but also what that meant in the time of COVID. And that brings me to this slide here. Our savior, I hope you can see who's behind these masks. I'm here on the left. My partner in crime, our artistic director at the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, Davis McCallum, is on the right. And in the middle is my senator from New York, our Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer. And so, or I should, our knight in shining armor, as you might say. This is Senator Schumer with us standing on the grounds of Boscobel in April of 2021 as a part of his sort of victory tour after passing the Save Our Stages Act, which some of you may have heard about. It was a part of the COVID relief bill. And included $16 billion with a B dollars towards the recovery of theaters and other performing arts venues throughout the nation. And I want to give a brief shout out to Truman scholar John Cardinal. He's a 2007 scholar who serves as Senator Schumer's Director of Economic Development. I don't know if anybody here on this Zoom is familiar with John, but as I understand, John actually drafted that bill. He is the one who wrote it. He's the one who really, he's a friend of mine. I continue to be grateful to him and correspond with him about how that bill and those funds transformed our ability as an industry and as an organization to move forward. But if you speak to John, thanks, Terry. Yeah, everybody should be a John Cardinal fan. If you speak to him, please thank him on my behalf. And I bring this slide up to say, we were at a perilous moment, I think, the winter of 2020, wondering what was next. In comes Senator Schumer. We were also recipients of the PPP funds, the federal, it was a loan that turned into a grant for our organization to keep people on payroll. And, as we thought about, there's almost $1.4 million of creative jobs lost. And I've read from Brookings Institution almost 43 billion with the B dollars lost in sales related to the creative economy as a whole, not just the theater, but all creative outlets. And, thank you to Senator Schumer for allowing us to think about what was next and how to move forward. which does bring me to some of the future. As I mentioned at the top of this conversation, we did have a 2021 summer season at the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, as was mentioned in the New York Times Theater Preview. Typically in a season, we would have had 5 plays running in rotating repertory. This summer, for COVID safety reasons, we did not run in repertory. We had 2 plays live and in person. They were masked, they were at a distance seating, it was outdoors with required vaccination, all types of words I never would have felt like I needed to explain to you in any other year of producing theater. But we were able to do it. We were able to have an audience. We were able to employ actors and stagehands and designers and directors and an up and coming playwright. It was just a real extraordinary moment for us. And as you heard at the beginning, Broadway is just reopening this week. We opened our season in June, and there was a couple of moments in June where we, in fact, were the only live theater you could see in New York other than Bruce Springsteen on Broadway. So we were pretty thrilled about that when the Sunday New York Times spoke about us and Springsteen. I should note that this slide also includes a production of Macbeth that we ended up producing as an audio play in lieu of our school tour, which was distributed as a podcast to schools and then also shared with our audience just as an audio play for people to listen to into the spring. So we made theater. What we were also at this moment needing to focus on something bigger, which was what do we do with this extraordinary opportunity that Chris Davis had given our organization? And I continue to kind of pinch myself when I wake up in the morning that we are so lucky as a theater institution in 2021 to not only have been able to produce, but to be able to think about a long-term sustainable solution for our organization in such a time of uncertainty for our industry. And I think our staff knows it, we know it, that we just had this moment to focus on what was next. So we spent some time with our staff to think about what we wanted to focus our priorities towards as we just had to kind of break down what to do with 100 acres of property. And these are sort of I'm going to speak to those now over the next couple of slides. First, we wanted to think about cultural placemaking. The second was about community engagement. And the third was about environmental sustainability. And to just dig into those a little bit deeper, with regards to cultural placemaking, this is actually a rendering of a theater venue, a permanent theater venue on the site of our new home with a new view in the distance, for those who are familiar with the current view. How do we create a world-class cultural destination in the heart of the Hudson Valley? How do we make sure that that destination provides economic vitality for our region and actually economic and cultural recovery for our state? Which means that it needs to be a safe model for theater making in a hopefully post-COVID era, I should say, that hopefully in parentheses, and to support our ongoing goal of ensuring artistic excellence. How could we improve the quality of sight lines, of audibility and sound? How does the audience experience and artist experience get better once we have permanent facilities? And there's a couple things I can speak to about that. As I mentioned, our temporary facilities that came up and went down, and this would be a permanent structure. So that means that we will be able to continue to produce deep into the fall, which means that we can have more economic impact, that it can be more of a cultural destination because we'll be running past Labor Day. And we can really change some of our production practices to ensure artistic excellence with a permanent facility. Community access, and this goes back to my intro about my Truman policy proposal here. But this site has been a golf course for a really long time, and that means that there's open space, but we also are receiving some interior buildings that have been event spaces and will continue to be for weddings and rentals. But how do we open up those spaces for the community? How can those become spaces for local nonprofits or school groups? How can we offer them for workshops and artistic community classes for our neighbors? How can we think about on-site education differently? Because not only can we keep going to schools, but we can now welcome schools on-site for fall matinees and for educational opportunities. And this has been something that we've been really getting excited about. Could there be a farmer's market on site? Or how can we think about the education opportunity as something that is really intersectional, that it could be a full day field trip and students can come for a walking tour of this extraordinary Hudson Valley site and learn about the revolutionary history of this place, the indigenous history, the ecological and environmental history, and then see a play, and then have a Shakespeare workshop afterwards to learn more about theater and theater making. So we're getting really excited about the possibilities, particularly next to this priority. This is something that has come out of some of the intersections that we have been thinking about with relation to our national sort of interrogation around equity and inclusion. And we have this great opportunity that we are not just moving our theater, but we are building a new theater space and we're building a new site. So how do we design that site that is open for the community, that's expanding that community access with an eye for equity and inclusion? How do we make sure that this site feels welcoming to all, 2.25 million residents of the Hudson Valley, and that feels like a space for everyone? How do we think about that with an eye for physical and cognitive accessibility, thinking about where on site and how we acknowledge the indigenous peoples for whom this land is their ancestral homeland? And how do we endow programming that is created and envisioned by BIPOC artists that can specifically help to engage the site in a new way and offer a voice to artists who haven't necessarily had as loud a voice in our industry? This is all kind of tied together in a big bucket about environmental stewardship. And some brief history, which is to say that this parcel of 200 acres was purchased by Chris Davis, our benefactor, in 1999. It was a golf course at that time as well, but he was worried as there were a number of developers circling the site. The golf course had gone into both disrepair and sort of economic challenge, and he wanted to ensure that the site wouldn't get subdivided into hundreds of condos. And instead, he purchased it to maintain the open space and has spent the last 20 years trying to figure out what to do with it. He's not a golfer and didn't really care for golfing, but wanted to make sure that the site didn't become something else. And we are incredibly lucky to get to be a part of his vision for what's next here. And I'll say, as a person whose profession is theater administration, and that's what my training is, I have become incredibly fluent in speaking about environmental stewardship and sustainability in a way that I wouldn't have been even just 6 months ago. Because in fact, golf courses, while they might look green, are incredibly dangerous to our environment. They are filled with pesticides. There's excessive gas-powered mowing. There is a significant amount of water waste and irrigation. And they in fact create, as I'm learning, a grass monoculture that totally depletes any sense of biodiversity, removes pollinators, and is a real danger, in fact. So we have this huge opportunity to ecologically restore a riparian site. It's right along the Hudson River, and to bring back that biodiversity, to create new meadowed spaces, native wildflower gardens, walking paths to allow the community to engage in these spaces, while truly trying to think about carbon neutrality, because we can really have some significant carbon sequestration as we get rid of some of these low-mown golf fairways and tees and turn them into open meadows. I hope I don't have any serious golfers on this call, and if I do, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But I also want to think about, as we are thinking about what those priorities are, we know that it needs to be a benefit to our greater community. And we really wanted to think about how we can maximize economic impact, which is about expanding opportunities for job creation, how we can increase our economic stimulation, what that means with more jobs and more people coming as we create a tourist destination and offer lodging and activities that could happen all weekend long in the region. And we see this as a huge opportunity to help us speak about what's next for this project. This is another picture of us with some elected officials for my New Yorkers on this call. This is myself and Davis McCallum, Artistic Director, with our now Governor, Kathy Hochul. In this picture, she was still Lieutenant Governor. This was in June, and she came to visit the site. But I showed this image as one to say, we've got some smart people here who can imagine that while the Shakespeare Festival has received 100 acres of land, we still need to do some significant fundraising to actually build out this cultural campus that I'm speaking about. We're a nonprofit. And we've invested a lot of time and really conversation and ideas with our elected officials, all the way down to our town supervisor, local planning board, our county executive, all the way up to now our governor, and including our senators, Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand, and our Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, and in building the argument for why this site will be transformative to our community. And we are hoping to receive some significant state and federal funds through the newly invigorated earmark process that I'm learning a lot about. We've got, it's a Truman call. I had to make sure I got in our elected officials here and spoke a little bit about the opportunities for federal funding and state funding to support the arts, which are going to be really significant in ensuring that we can complete this project. All right, so I'm wrapping up here just to say that now comes the cherry on top. I just want to show you all a couple of renderings of how we envision the site would look upon completion of the cultural campus. So I'll show those two renderings and then I can stop sharing and we can have more of a conversation. This is the first, which is I can kind of walk you all through it. You can imagine that this had all been golf course, and starting here in my bottom right-hand corner, this would be a permeable, environmentally sensitive parking lot, which would allow audience members to arrive and walk through a native wildflower garden here through all different paths, and reach a box office to pick up your tickets and potentially a picnic that you purchased in advance before coming for your experience that day. This area here is currently 6 acres of golf course that would be totally transformed into 6 acres of meadow. With all these different pathways through it for people to walk and experience and to encourage pollinators and birds through the site. And you would walk up to an area at this very top, which has 3 lawns that will be mown for picnicking, that you could enjoy the spectacular view of the Hudson River, and then enter the open air but permanent theater facility here, and maybe pick up a glass of wine at our concession stand right there. And the other rendering is kind of with your back to that view, looking at these 3 picnic lawns with the theater to the back here. And this always gets me excited because as we talk about creating a space for community engagement, these spaces don't only have to be open, before the theater hours, but can be open for our community at any time during the day for people to sit out and read a book or, throw a ball around and to really engage in both this view and to open up a site that has only been available to golfers to our whole community at all times during the day. That's all I've got to say about sort of the big plans for the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival. I'm eager to have a conversation with this group to hear what questions you might have about our big project, about producing theater in a time of a pandemic, and in the return of live theater in our country and in New York State. So thank you all, and excited to have a conversation.
Katie, thank you so much. And I realize we have kind of a nice intimate group. We can probably field a number of questions, and people are welcome to unmute and just go ahead and ask their questions live. I know David Treacher, you had a question, right? Do you want to jump in? And if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Thanks, Terry. Hi, Kate. Hi, everyone. My name's
Hi,
David. I'm a friend of Terry's from Hawaii, where we met. I recently moved to the DC area as a military spouse, having put my 14-year diplomatic career serving as a diplomat for the New Zealand government, having put that on hold to follow my military spouse. And I'm a long time fan of the arts, and also have a background in performing myself in theatre and opera and choirs. First of all, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Kate. I am new to the East Coast and will definitely be putting a trip to the Hudson Valley next summer, at least once, to see some shows. And secondly, congratulations on the exciting new chapter that you have for the company, with the incredible new property and the wonderful plans you have. It sounds like, despite the challenges of the past 18 months where it sounds like the arts sector and your organization in particular are really moving forward in an exciting way. My questions are kind of quite narrow. Interested to hear from your experience as a professional, as I'm exploring different career paths, and particularly really interested in potentially moving into the arts management sector. So if you would indulge me with sharing some of your experience, I'd love to hear more about, firstly, what your favorite part of your role is. What advice would you have for someone interested in making a mid-career move into the performing arts management sector? And if you feel comfortable sharing as well, what are the top 3 hard and soft skills someone in your field should have? Thank you.
Those are some tough questions, David. Okay, some of them are easier than others. So I realize I didn't speak about this in my presentation, but my title is Managing Director of the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival. And in the nonprofit theater industry, I should say, there's a unique leadership structure for theaters where we have an artistic director and a managing director, and we co-lead the institution, and we jointly report to the board of directors as executive leadership. And so in my role, I partner, as you heard, with a guy named Davis McCallum, who's a Rhodes Scholar, not a Truman Scholar, but still a friend of Truman, I should say. Davis really is the visionary for the institution. It's his role to think about what plays we are producing or we should be producing, which playwrights we should be watching for, who's up and coming in the industry, how we're structuring or restructuring the both long-term and short-term artistic production work for what we do. And then it's my job to figure out how to make that happen. I oversee the operations, our institutional staff, a lot of our institutional staff, fundraising and marketing, and sort of both the day-to-day, but then also the build-up and implementation of some of the more visionary aspects. And I'll say it sounds complicated to have a sort of dual-headed leadership structure, but in fact, as long as you have a great partnership, which I feel very lucky to have, and not every theater does, it's really extraordinary, and it ensures that the institution can actually be more nimble, because there's sort of 2 sides of the coin in making live theater, right? There's the side of dreaming, imagining, and then there's a side of practicality. And at different times in our conversations, Davis and I are each wearing the opposite hat. Sometimes I have this crazy idea, and he says, I don't think we can do that, or vice versa. Or we say, well, I think we can do that in 3 years, and here's how we can lead up to it. And it's a really special way that our industry works. So that spoke a little bit about my role. That also means that I'm certainly never bored on any given day. I might be talking to our attorneys about what the transaction of 100 acres is going to be, or calling the playwright to talk about a play that we want to get the rights to, or reaching out, talking to my development director about what the gala theme is going to be, or preparing for our audit. It could be a whole number of things. And so it's a real exciting world in my role, where I get to kind of have my finger in a lot of different pots on the stove at different times. But I do think that theater administration is a really special field that requires smart and thoughtful people who have a passion for the work. I'll say I'm not an actor. I have my last experience on stage was in high school, and it wasn't great. I was one of the gentlemen in the government inspector, which is an almost all male play, but my high school still chose to produce it with an almost all female cast, and there was a lot of 16-year-old women wearing mustaches and fake spectacles and things. Not really very well done. And it's really about having a passion for the work and the real community gathering aspect of it, while knowing that it's an industry that really needs smart people to think with an administrative mind, thoughtful budgeting tactics, in a world that I feel really lucky that I actually get to call my friend John Cardinal and talk about what the earmark process is going to be and what it means to negotiate for our organization to be at the top list of a local official's funding priorities. So it's a really unique position to be in, if all of those things sound of interest to you. maybe minus the preparation for the audit. All of those things are fun. I'm not sure if I answered all of your questions, David, but that was a quick roundup to speak a little bit about my role and responsibilities.
Thank you, appreciate it. And it sounds like it's an incredibly varied job day to day, the full range of things you're doing.
Right. I think there's something in the chat here. Oh yeah, so this is a thank you, Anmar, for your question. I guess I'll repeat it out from the chat. Anmar asked if I could speak about my dual degrees and how that helps me in my day-to-day operations. Oh, you just took yourself off.
Yeah,
Hi.
I just yeah. Yes, let me just ask it in person, not in person, like actually ask it. So yes, my name is Anmar Georgis. I am from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I work in Charlotte, North Carolina, and looking into applying to Yale for the business degree as well as the MPP degree. And I would like to hear from you, just to speak about how your two degrees, which might be different from what I'm looking into, helped you in your work, whether it's your career, the connections you made, the courses you took. I would just like to know that. I think.
Thank you. I lost some of the audio at the end of that, but I think I understand the question. And if I don't, you should just follow up with a follow-up question. So yes, I did a joint degree, an MFA at the Yale School of Drama, specifically in theater management, and then an MBA at the Yale School of Management. And it was concurrent. It was 4 years in New Haven. A unique time to be there, but I am grateful to have both degrees. I'll say in a day-to-day, and this really has to do with the strength of the Yale School of Drama Theater Management program, in a day-to-day, I'm really using a lot of the skills I received from that program, which has to do with budgeting for nonprofit theater and staff management and nonprofit management and fundraising. A lot of that came through those skills. I'll say there's other skills that I got from the MBA program, specifically related to networking and community building and relationship building, as well as, I'll say honestly, a greater understanding for global finance and corporate finance that I do still use. And I also use it in relation to conversations with board members. As a person who works in a nonprofit, I report to 25 board members, a number of whom work in a financial industry. And I think it's good for me to also be fluent in some of the things that they are doing day to day, which before I had an MBA, I really didn't understand. Having been an English and theater major, I totally ignored any of that in my undergrad. So it has helped me become both fluent in something and be able to speak to it in a different way in the boardroom, but also to sort of be able to follow it and understand how those things impact my institution. The last thing I'll say, and I see that your name says that you're involved with the Duke Endowment. We are an organization that doesn't have an endowment. We do have a cash reserve that's invested, but it's not specifically endowed. But in the midst of, as we are fundraising for our new home, a part of that campaign is to create our first ever endowment. And a lot of what I've learned about significant investments and endowment management has come from my business school degree. And so as I'm speaking to why that's a necessity for our institution and how that's going to be significant to allow us to move forward and how we can bring on external managers to help us think about how those funds should be invested and why, that comes from the other degree. So it really is a mishmash. I'll say for the other alums of my program or programs, there are people who have similar roles to me who did not do the MBA, who came out of the Yale School of Drama program, and I have some colleagues from my MBA program who are in executive positions at nonprofits. So the joint is not a necessity to have a role like this, but I have found it to be incredibly helpful. And I should say, as Terry knows, I also met my husband there, so it had some great impact on my future. Some of you might know Tara Iglesias at the foundation, who the most significant thing I remember her telling me and my cohort during TSLW, the Truman Scholars Leadership Week, was pick your partner with care because they will have impact on the rest of your future professionally and personally. And I don't think I really understood that when I was there, but I greatly understand that now as I am co-parenting a toddler and working in this significant professional capacity and with a partner. And I'm always grateful to Yale for introducing me to a great partner as well.
So Katie, given that you've put Eric on the table, I'm going to go ahead and broaden the aperture if you'll indulge me.
Yes.
I can only imagine the dinner table conversations you guys are having to provide context for those who haven't had the joy of meeting both Katie and Eric. They are brilliant and wonderful and both involved in this challenging world that is arts management these days. I just love to hear if you could just, as you have your finger on the pulse of what's happening in live theater and the arts broadly there in the broader New York community, can you just give a sense of kind of what the conversation's like, what it feels like, what your colleagues and friends are saying as we navigate this time? Because obviously we're continuing to live with COVID for a while.
Yes. So yes, my husband's an arts consultant, and he consults with nonprofits. He also consults with municipalities who are specifically looking to create a cultural district or a cultural sort of destination, honestly, in their community to increase economic impact. He works for a firm called AEA Consulting. And yes, Terry, we talk about this all the time at our dinner table. Eric's work has really blown up since the pandemic because everyone's looking for a consultant to tell them what to do next. And he specifically focuses on sort of strategic planning in relation to crisis management. So it is a good time to call Eric if you need help. But to speak to the greater moment, I think everyone's a little bit holding their breath. As you mentioned, there was a theater reopening sort of whole section in the Times this past weekend. And there have been a couple of the sort of a slow trickle of shows, but over the next 2 weeks, there's going to be a huge reopening of live performances indoors, vaccination required for a masked audience, but they're not distancing people with vaccination and masking. And no one quite knows if there's going to be an appetite for it. There's also, because of what we spoke about earlier, the sort of nationwide reckoning around race, and I hope a real rejiggering of our focus on the voices that we highlight as a theater industry. There are, I believe, 7 plays that are going to be opening on Broadway this season that are written by a Black playwright, which is a huge change in the world of Broadway for those who follow Broadway in particular. And I'll say Broadway is not the end all and be all of theater as a manager of a nonprofit regional theater organization, but it does give you a sense of some of the taste making, at least as it's understood from the industry. And I think there's a real hope that this is an indication of a sea change in the voices that are heard, but there's also a question of what that audience is going to be for that. And I hope that there's a real extraordinary audience response because there's some really special plays that are going to be produced this year and that people will come out. So all that said, I think there's this joint uncertainty between what it will mean to come back in person and how to make sure that the actors and the audience and the staff are all safe. And at the same time, trying to share the voices that have not been heard for centuries on stages in the United States. One more thing I will point out, because I don't know if everyone is reading this in your headlines, if you have the same news digest that I do, but there is a big ongoing conversation about a union strike, the IATSE union, which is the stagehand union, and they have a bunch of different locals designations, which includes theater stagehands as well as TV and movies, people in different states and designations. But there's a huge threat that there's going to be an IATSE strike starting this weekend, specifically related to the hours and the conditions that stagehands have been required to work to create all of the extraordinary TV and movie content that we have had the pleasure of watching from the safety and comfort in our homes. And it is spreading into some of the world of the theater. There are a lot of stagehands who cross, it's a freelance field. There's a lot of people who cross between those two industries. And in particular, this weekend is the Tony Awards. And it's an award ceremony for plays that were produced back in the spring of 2020 and were shuttered, as well as the 2020 season. But there's a question about whether those Tony Awards will be able to go on if there's an IATSE strike. So just some of the headlines in the world of the dinner table at my house, Terry, is a little bit about COVID safety, about pending labor challenges and strike. And I should say, additionally with labor, I'm sure everyone has read about just nationwide labor shortages and what that's meaning for the economy, specifically for hourly labor or different types of industries that you might be seeing. And we're definitely seeing it in the theater. We had a real struggle finding stagehands this summer and finding physical and manual labor to help us install and strike our tent structures. We actually ended up calling in a temp firm to help us fill some of those roles. And for hourly jobs like our concession stand and ushers. So it's going to be, you know, as we think about that on a global level about economic impact and change in the labor industry, we're definitely even seeing it at the theater level. And then the last piece is just about stories being told on stage. Yeah, Jeff, I see you have a question and you raised your hand.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for coming today and sharing. I will say that my wife and I got to, we stayed up nearby and we're hiking in Hudson Highlands and stumbled onto your Shakespeare Festival on our way up to visit my parents and had not figured out our plan to come back. And on our return trip, made an extra stop that we had not planned just to return to your Shakespeare Festival. That I think was your first year. So we got to see The Tempest, and it was done by high school students, which I wanted to shout out. The fact that you have these folks that work all summer long and then get an opportunity to run their own performance, which it was totally unexpected. We didn't know that was what it was going to be, but we really felt lucky to see a theater doing that, and wanted to call that out. Just, that's not a question, but I just wanted to shout you out for that.
Thank you.
But I had two really unrelated questions. One is like, what is the work week like for somebody with all the different roles that you have to play, all the different people you have to talk to, and then you also have theater productions at night and stuff, and weekends and stuff. What is the work week like, and how does that work for somebody with a young family? That's kind of like the work side of it. And the other thing is, you know, we've kind of gotten reintroduced to the theater, and I will give your theater credit for getting me more interested in regional theater. And I go to regional theater to be intellectually challenged and emotionally challenged. I go to Broadway and get entertained and wowed and awed, and they're amazing productions. But there's a lot of, I think, really important things being said in regional theater, but it doesn't have the eyeballs on it. Do you have a thought about how what's going on in regional theater gets kind of more visibility and those kind of discussions happen on a broader stage?
Two totally different questions, Jeff. Okay, so let me speak to the first one first. The schedule in the theater is just, it's tough. It's really tough. And among the things that we're talking about as we actually talk about equity and inclusion in the industry is changes to the schedule. You know, if you're an artist or a technician or a designer in a technical rehearsal, it's called a 10 out of 12 because you work for 10 out of 12 hours with 2 breaks, a 1-hour dinner break and a 1-hour lunch break. 10 out of 12, and there's a whole fight to say, you know, a 10 out of 12 is actually not a humane workspace, and that we need to think differently about the number of hours that we're asking people to work. And I'll say in my world, we have different. What's really complicated actually in my world is that I overlap with people who have different roles with very different schedules. So we have staff on a 6-day work week that they work all weekend and then they don't come in on a Monday or a Tuesday. Or I have staff like our finance staff or administrators who work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So it's a real complex thinking about, oh, should I send that email? Are they in today? Are they here now? Can we have that meeting? You know, there is a little bit of a complexity about that and finding how we all build a culture as an organization that we're really all in this together when we're not actually all together at the same time. And this has been a challenge in every theater I've worked at, not just the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, when you think about company culture, between the administrative staff, the technical staff backstage, the artists who are on stage, and your front of house staff, your box office, your ushers, and how to ensure a sense of both continuity and a sense of feeling about being collective and all working for the same long-term mission. And that's really a challenge. And I'll say for me personally, I'm typically working Monday through Friday on a regular work schedule. But in the evenings when we're in season, when we're producing, I will go to the theater to greet people like Terry and Brian who came, or if I had known you were coming with your wife, I will come and greet friends or greet donors or greet, elected officials who are coming to the theater that evening. I do not watch the show every night, but I will be there for opening night, for a preview to give notes, for closing night, and for special occasions. And then often on weekends, I do find myself back at my computer because there's not enough hours in the day that, as we all know, in the world of email, to get through the correspondence that happens during the week because of that. So it's a challenge, but it's definitely something that kind of known that I knew going into. I don't know if that fully answered that question. The hours that theater people keep are complex. And there's a real conversation, as you mentioned, about people with families in the industry about how we ensure that people have time with their families. If you're inviting an actor or an artist from New York City to come to work for your theater in Cleveland or even in Hudson Valley or in Rhode Island, and you have housing that allows them to bring their spouse or to bring their children, and do you make sure that there's space and a car and access for people to actually travel with their families, or are you asking them to work on a 3-month contract and be away from their families? So it's a big conversation that's happening across the industry right now. Your second question was about the distinction between kind of commercial theater and nonprofit, is that right?
Yeah, I guess maybe it is the nonprofit angle, but I'm not sure if they're all nonprofit, but the regional theater just presents some just really stimulating work, but in a very different way than like the stimulation you get from like a Broadway entertainment experience. And like, how do we get more, like, how do we get that more into the mainstream and not in just these regional theaters?
So it all comes back to economics and capitalism. I don't know if that's what you thought you were going to have from a theater conversation here today, but it really does have to do with the difference between a nonprofit model versus a commercial model. And Broadway, there's 3 Broadway venues that are nonprofit, Lincoln Center, Manhattan Theater Club, and the Roundabout Theater. And all the other venues are commercial, which means that if you want to produce a Broadway show, you have to entice investors to invest money, and those investors are expecting a kickback after a certain amount of success. And to ensure economic success, you need to sell a certain number of tickets at a certain number of price that exceeds your initial investment and exceeds then the running costs of the show, which can also be significant because it's a very labor-heavy industry with a number of unions, actors, directors, stagehands, as we talked about, musicians, if it's a musical. So the running costs are incredibly expensive, including the rental of the theater. You're getting a brief economics lesson in theater, commercial theater and nonprofit theater, and all you've got is ticket sales, which is also why you might have to pay, $300 to $500 to see a Broadway show to help sort of make good on those investments. And therefore, everyone is looking for entertainment value. It's an industry that's based on tourism in New York City and how we can sell the most tickets based on entertainment. So a big title like a Disney title might sell a lot more tickets than an unheard of, unknown new playwright. The regional theater industry is a nonprofit industry, and so we receive funds. Our revenue model comes from ticket sales, yes. Also, we have other earned revenue that might come from our concessions or comes from educational programming that we can earn. But also, it's about 50-50 from our earned revenue and contributed revenue. And so 50% of what we do at the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival comes through individuals, like the people on the Zoom, from foundations, from our federal and local governments that ensure that we have the support to move forward. And that actually allows us to take different kinds of risks, because 100% of our revenue is not coming from ticket sales. So we can take risks on the type of work that we do because of that nonprofit model, that we have another cushion to balance out our expenses and a real risk cushion to do that. It's something I talk to our board about all the time. So I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Katie. And a great question, Jeff, for sure. And Jeff, for those of you who don't know, Jeff is one of the many people who is working hard in our federal government to keep us all safe these days. So really appreciate all you do as well. Indeed. Such a great conversation. And I realize there's so much more as Andrew Lee has jumped on with a great question about NFTs and Patreon. I'm sure we could continue for quite a while, but I do want to be mindful of time. Katie, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you certainly for your example of innovative leadership. I love the festival, so just so appreciate all you do. There's also just so much in your world that's not my expertise. So as you speak to theater administration, I always feel like I learn from you, which is great. But it's also kind of heartwarming for you to step into my world as you speak to the dangers of monoculture. So thank you. I'm convinced there's nothing you can't or don't do. So thank you for that. As the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival is definitely one of our annual go-tos. I'm really going to be excited to see you next season. You had no way of knowing, but you have an invitation from the Culinary Institute of America to use one of their auditoriums for an indoor performance. If that's of interest, I'm happy to make the introduction. Michael Sperling, who I think had to hop.
Hi, Michael. Thank you.
Hopefully he's still with us, but I just want to let you know, and we can follow on after that. You never know what happens when you put good people together. I'd like to think good things happen. So we can follow up there. I know there are plenty of others like Anmar and Danny and David who are probably keen to learn more about your own career. But I'm just going to extend an invitation for those of you who have not yet been to the Hudson Valley or the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival. We hope to see you there next summer in a healthier, brighter 2022. So with that, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Katie, thank you for your generosity today and time and expertise. We're going to look forward to seeing everyone October 6th for our third and what we hope will be our final COVID panel. We're convening that with actually in partnership with the Marshall Scholars. That's going to be a great chat. Hope you can join us for that. And with that, I think there's a lot of gratitude we're going to see in the chat here as people are having to hop to meetings. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. And this concludes our program.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet you all.
Bye, everyone. Take a